Sometimes the smallest decisions, like helping a stranger, can set off a chain reaction that changes everything. For Darius Walker, a kind-hearted man from a quiet town, it all began with a flat tire and a woman stranded on the side of the road. But within 24 hours, his life would spiral into a whirlwind of secrets, danger, and an offer that could alter his future forever. And it all started with an SUV parked outside his house. Before we dive into this incredible story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy tales of unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Darius Walker wasn't the kind of man to stand out in a crowd, but in Ridgewood, his presence was impossible to ignore. Everyone in the small town knew him, not because of any grand achievements or flashy lifestyle, but for his big heart and willingness to help anyone in need. At 37, Darius lived a modest life in a cozy single-story home on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was filled with memories and warmth, the kind of place that always felt like home. His days began early, just before sunrise, when the streets were still quiet and the world felt at peace. Darius had a ritual. He'd brew a strong cup of coffee and sit on his porch, watching the sky shift from deep purple to golden hues as the sun peeked over the trees. For him, these moments were a reminder of how beautiful simplicity could be. By mid-morning, Darius was at the Ridgewood Community Center, where he worked as a maintenance technician. The job was humble, but Darius loved it. Whether it was fixing a broken chair or organizing supplies for local events, he found joy in the little things. To him, every task was a chance to make someone's day a bit brighter. Around town, people always greeted him with a wave or a friendly smile. From Mrs. Carter at the bakery, who always slipped him an extra pastry, to the kids at the community center, who adored his easygoing nature, Darius had built a reputation as someone everyone could rely on. He wasn't rich or famous, but he was rich in kindness, a trait that would soon become both a blessing and a curse. It was a quiet evening when the fateful encounter happened. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and pink in the sky. Darius was driving home along the winding back roads on the outskirts of Ridgewood. He liked taking the scenic route, enjoying the solitude and the sound of his truck's engine humming steadily beneath him. As he rounded a sharp curve, his headlights illuminated a car pulled off to the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking in the dim twilight. Standing beside it was a woman, pacing nervously. Her body language screamed distress, and even from a distance, Darius could tell she was out of her depth. Without hesitation, he pulled over, his truck coming to a gentle stop a few feet away. As he stepped out, the woman turned to face him, her expression a mix of relief and wariness. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with shoulder-length auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her outfit, a tailored blouse and skirt, suggested she'd just come from work. But it was clear she'd been struggling. Her blouse was wrinkled, and her shoes were dusty from pacing along the gravel shoulder. "Hey there," Darius called out in his usual friendly tone. "Looks like you've got some trouble. Need a hand?" The woman nodded, her voice shaky as she replied, "Yes, please, my tire went flat, and I have no idea how to change it. I've been trying to figure it out, but..." She gestured helplessly to the mess of tools scattered near the car. "Don't worry about it," Darius said, already rolling up his sleeves. "I'll get you sorted in no time." As he approached the car, he noticed the brand, sleek and expensive, far from the practical sedans and trucks most Ridgewood residents drove. The silver paint gleamed under the dimming light, but the rear passenger tire was completely deflated. Darius crouched down to inspect it, his practiced hands already reaching for the jack. The woman lingered nearby, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. Darius couldn't help but notice how often she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes darting toward the darkened road behind them. "You okay?" he asked, looking up briefly. She hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little on edge, I guess. It's been a long day." Darius didn't press her for details. People had their reasons for being guarded, and he respected that. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, loosening the lug nuts and swapping the damaged tire for the spare. His movements were smooth and efficient, the product of years spent helping out friends and neighbors with similar problems. "You must have hit a nasty pothole," he said conversationally, trying to put her at ease. "These roads are full of them." "Yeah," she replied, her voice still tight. "I didn't even notice until it was too late." "Ridgewood's a quiet place, but it's not easy on tires," Darius added with a chuckle. "You new around here?" She nodded, clutching her purse a little tighter. "Just moved a couple of months ago, still figuring things out." "Well, welcome to Ridgewood," Darius said warmly. "It's a good town. Folks here look out for each other." Her smile was faint but genuine this time. "Thanks." In less than 10 minutes, Darius had the spare tire secured and the tools neatly packed away. He stood up, wiping his hands on an old rag he kept in his truck. "There you go," he said. "You're all set. Just make sure to get that tire fixed soon. The spare's not meant for long distances." The woman exhaled a shaky breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped." "It's no trouble," Darius replied with a shrug. "Just glad I was passing by." She reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp $50 bill, extending it toward him. "Please, take this. It's the least I can do." Darius waved her off with a kind smile. "Nah, I can't take your money. Helping out's enough for me." Her brow furrowed, clearly not expecting him to refuse. "Are you sure?" "It's really no problem." "I'm sure," Darius said firmly but kindly. "Drive safe, okay?" The woman hesitated, then tucked the money back into her purse. "Thank you again. Darius," he offered. "Lena," she said. "Lena Carter." "Nice to meet you, Lena," Darius said, tipping an imaginary hat. "Take care now." As Lena climbed back into her car and drove off into the night, Darius watched her taillights disappear around the bend. Something about the encounter lingered with him, the nervous way she'd glanced over her shoulder, the tension in her voice. But he shook it off, chalking it up to the stress of being stranded on a dark road. By the time Darius arrived home, the incident was already fading from his mind. It was just another good deed, he thought. A small kindness in a world that could always use more of it. Little did he know that simple act of generosity had set into motion a chain of events that would turn his quiet life in Ridgewood upside down. The next morning, Darius woke up to the sound of chirping birds and the warm glow of sunlight streaming through his bedroom window. He stretched, shaking off the remnants of sleep, and made his way to the kitchen for his usual morning routine. A strong cup of coffee and a few quiet moments on the porch before the day began. He poured the coffee into his favorite chipped mug and stepped outside, the cool morning air greeting him like an old friend. Ridgewood was always peaceful at this hour, with only the distant hum of an occasional car and the rustle of leaves in the breeze to break the silence. Darius leaned against the porch railing, sipping his coffee, his eyes wandering across the sleepy street. That's when he noticed it. Parked just a few houses down was a sleek black SUV, shiny and new. It wasn't the kind of car you typically saw in Ridgewood, where most folks drove well-loved trucks or older sedans. The SUV stood out like a sore thumb. its glossy exterior catching the morning light in a way that almost seemed deliberate. At first, Darius didn't think much of it. Maybe someone was visiting one of the neighbors, but as the minutes ticked by, he found his gaze drifting back to it, unease creeping in like a shadow. The car was completely still, and there was no sign of anyone inside. The windows were tinted so darkly that even the bright morning sun couldn't reveal what lay behind them. Darius frowned, finishing his coffee and heading back inside to prepare for the day. It wasn't like him to dwell on something so small. Ridgewood was a friendly town, quiet and safe. People here looked out for one another, and there was rarely anything out of the ordinary. Still, the image of the SUV lingered in the back of his mind as he went about his morning. By mid-morning, the SUV was still there, parked in the exact same spot. Darius had left for the community center, expecting it to be gone by the time he returned. But when he pulled into his driveway around lunchtime, the shiny black vehicle was as stationary and silent as ever. He squinted at it through the windshield of his truck, a small knot of curiosity tightening in his chest. It wasn't long before the rest of the neighborhood started to notice. Ridgewood wasn't a place where things went unnoticed for long, and an unfamiliar car was sure to spark conversation. Mrs. Pickens, the elderly woman who lived next door, was the first to bring it up. She ambled over to Darius's yard as he was unloading tools from his truck. "Morning, Darius," she said, her tone casual but her eyes darting toward the SUV. "You notice that car down there? Don't recognize it." "Yeah, I saw it," Darius replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Figured it belonged to one of the neighbors." Mrs. Pickens shook her head, her gray curls bouncing. "I don't think so. Been out here all morning and I haven't seen anyone come or go. Strange, don't you think?" Darius shrugged, though her words only fueled the unease that had been simmering all day. "Probably nothing," he said, more to reassure himself than her. "Someone might have left it there while running an errand." But Mrs. Pickens didn't look convinced. "Well, I don't like it," she said, crossing her arms. "Not one bit." By mid-afternoon, the SUV had become the talk of the block. Darius caught snippets of conversations as he worked on small repairs around his house. People speculated about who it belonged to and why it hadn't moved. Some thought it might be someone scoping out the neighborhood. Others wondered if it was just a lost tourist unfamiliar with Ridgewood's sleepy streets. Darius tried to brush it off, but the more he heard, the more the tension in his chest grew. It wasn't like Ridgewood to have something so out of place, and the lack of any explanation only made it more unsettling. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Darius finally decided he'd had enough. The SUV had been parked there for hours without a single sign of activity, and the unease gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Setting his tools aside, he wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped off his porch, heading toward the vehicle. The air was cool now, the quiet of the evening broken only by the faint chirping of crickets. Darius's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, his eyes fixed on the darkened windows of the SUV. The closer he got, the more he felt the weight of its presence. It was almost as if the car itself was watching him, its glossy surface reflecting the dim light of the street lamp overhead. "Let's see what you're about," he muttered under his breath, his pace steady but cautious. As he neared the vehicle, his heart thudded in his chest. He felt a sudden, irrational fear, like he was walking into something he didn't fully understand. He was only a few steps away when, without warning, the SUV's engine roared to life. The sound shattered the stillness of the night, startling Darius and sending a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. The headlights flared on, casting long, sharp shadows across the street. Before Darius could get a good look at the driver, the SUV peeled away, tires screeching against the pavement as it sped down the road. He stood frozen in place, watching as it disappeared around the corner, its taillights fading into the darkness. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing, heavy and uneven. He turned and looked around, half expecting someone else to emerge from the shadows. But the street was empty. Ridgewood had fallen silent once more, as if nothing had happened. Darius slowly made his way back to his porch, his mind racing. He didn't know who was in that car or why they'd been parked outside his house all day, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a coincidence. As he sat down, his hands gripping the edge of the porch railing, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't over. The SUV wasn't just passing through. It was here for a reason, and that reason had something to do with him. The next day started like any other for Darius, though the events of the previous evening lingered in his mind. The black SUV's sudden departure had left him uneasy, but he told himself to let it go. Maybe it was just a coincidence, he thought, even though a nagging voice in the back of his head told him otherwise. As usual, Darius arrived at the Ridgewood Community Center bright and early. The center was a second home to him, a place where he felt connected to his town. He spent his days fixing things, organizing equipment, and helping out wherever he was needed. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was fulfilling. Ridgewood was small, and its people relied on each other to make things run smoothly. By mid-morning, Darius was in the middle of repairing a leaky faucet in the center's kitchen when Denise, the receptionist, popped her head in. "Hey, Darius," she said, her tone light but curious. "There's a car parked out front. Looks real fancy. You expecting someone?" Darius froze for a moment, the wrench in his hand hovering over the pipe. His mind immediately flashed back to the black SUV. "What kind of car?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Big, black, and shiny," Denise replied with a smirk. "The kind you see in those spy movies." Darius sighed, setting down the wrench. "Let me guess, tinted windows?" Denise nodded, her smirk fading slightly. "Yeah, it's kinda ominous. You know whose it is?" "No idea," Darius muttered, wiping his hands on a rag as he headed toward the front of the building. When he stepped outside, his stomach sank. There it was, the same black SUV that had been parked outside his house. It sat idling across the street, the dark windows giving no clue as to who was inside. Darius scanned the area, but no one seemed to be near the vehicle. The sight of it here, at his workplace, made the unease from the previous day come rushing back. "Darius," a voice called out from behind him. It was Greg, one of the janitors. He strolled over, hands in his pockets, his brow furrowed. "You know whose car that is? Been there about half an hour now." "No idea," Darius said, though his tone didn't carry much conviction. "It's probably nothing." Greg glanced at him skeptically. "Nothing? Man, that car looks like it belongs to someone important. Maybe you've got a secret admirer." Darius chuckled weakly, trying to brush it off, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the SUV's presence was far from harmless. He returned to the kitchen, hoping to immerse himself in work and forget about the car, but the buzz around the center made it impossible. Everywhere he went, people were whispering about the mysterious vehicle. "Did you see that car outside? Looks like something out of a crime show. Maybe someone's scouting the place." By lunchtime, Darius couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his sandwich from the break room and headed outside, determined to confront whoever was in the SUV. But as he stepped out onto the front steps, he saw two men standing by the vehicle, as if they'd been waiting for him. They were sharply dressed in dark suits that seemed out of place in Ridgewood. One was tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair slicked back neatly. The other was younger, stockier, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Both men carried an air of authority that made Darius's skin prickle. "Mr. Walker?" the older man asked, his voice smooth and professional. Darius hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, that's me. Who's asking?" The man extended a hand, which Darius reluctantly shook. "My name is Richard Allen, and this is my colleague, Mr. Grant. We've been looking forward to speaking with you." "Looking forward?" Darius repeated, his suspicion growing. "What's this about?" Richard smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We represent someone who is deeply grateful for a kindness you showed recently." Darius felt his chest tighten. His thoughts immediately went to Lena, the nervous woman on the side of the road. He kept his expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." The younger man, Grant, spoke up. "We're not here to cause you any trouble, Mr. Walker. Quite the opposite, actually. Our employer is very impressed by your actions." "I'm still not following," Darius said, crossing his arms. "Who's your employer, and what does this have to do with me?" Richard chuckled softly. "All in good time, Mr. Walker. For now, let's just say that your good deed didn't go unnoticed, and as a result, your life is about to change. For the better." Darius narrowed his eyes, his unease deepening. "That's a lot of fancy talk, but you're not telling me anything. What's this really about?" Richard reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small black card. It was completely plain, except for a single embossed phone number in silver. He held it out to Darius, who took it reluctantly. "If you're curious," Richard said, "give us a call. Someone will explain everything. And trust me, Mr. Walker, you'll want to hear what they have to say." "Is that a threat?" Darius asked, his tone sharp. "Not at all," Richard replied smoothly. "Simply an opportunity." Before Darius could press them further, both men turned and climbed back into the SUV. The engine purred to life, and the vehicle rolled away, disappearing down the street just as suddenly as it had appeared. Darius stood there, staring at the card in his hand, the embossed number catching the sunlight. He felt like he was holding a loaded gun, not dangerous in itself, but heavy with implications. As the SUV vanished from view, Darius's mind raced. Who were these men? And what did they mean by his life changing? Was this somehow connected to Lena and her strange behavior, or was it something bigger, something he couldn't yet see? One thing was certain. This wasn't the end of whatever was happening. It was only the beginning. The sun had long set by the time Darius returned home from work. It had been another ordinary day at the Ridgewood Community Center, filled with routine tasks and small repairs. Yet, the strange happenings of the past few days weighed heavily on his mind. The black SUV, the men in suits, and their cryptic warning all seemed to be converging into something he couldn't quite understand. He tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on the simple pleasures of his evening. Dinner, a quiet walk around his property, the peace that came with the comfort of his home. But as he settled into his easy chair that night, the knock on his door sent a jolt of alarm through him. Darius wasn't expecting anyone. He stood up, his heart rate quickening, and walked toward the door. He glanced out the peephole, half expecting to see the two men in suits standing there. But instead, it was Lena. Her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She looked nothing like the woman he had helped the other night, her composure shattered, replaced by an anxious, urgent energy that he couldn't ignore. "Lena," Darius said, his voice tentative as he opened the door. "What's going on? You look—" She cut him off before he could finish. "Please, I need to talk to you. I'm sorry for showing up like this, but I don't know who else to turn to." Lena's voice was tremulous, her words tumbling out in a rush. She was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly together. There was no mistaking the distress in her expression. Her usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by something far more vulnerable. "Come in," Darius said. Stepping aside and ushering her into the house, his mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The last time he saw Lena, she had been a stranger, a woman stranded on the side of the road. Now, it seemed like she was carrying a burden far heavier than a flat tire. Lena took a seat at the kitchen table, her eyes darting around the room nervously before she finally met Darius's gaze. "I didn't want to drag you into this, Darius," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted you to be involved, but I think you already are." Darius's heart skipped a beat, a feeling of dread settling over him. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Involved in what, Lena? What's going on?" She hesitated for a moment, then exhaled slowly, as if gathering the courage to tell him something she had been holding back for a long time. "The night you helped me, it wasn't just a flat tire," she said. "I was running away." Darius furrowed his brow, confused. Running away? From what? Lena's eyes filled with an emotion Darius couldn't quite place. Fear, regret, and something else he couldn't name. "From my family," she said, her voice cracking. "From the people who control my life." Darius's confusion only deepened. "Your family? What do you mean?" Lena looked down, as if weighing whether to reveal more. When she looked back up, her eyes were filled with a quiet desperation. "My family has a lot of power, Darius," she said slowly. "A lot of influence. My father, Richard Carter, he's a billionaire. He's built an empire, but it's not just business. He's involved in things. Things that put me in danger. People like him don't just make money, they make enemies. Dangerous ones." Darius's mind was spinning, trying to process the information. He had no idea that the woman he had helped was connected to such a powerful, influential family. Lena's words were beginning to sound like something out of a movie, a world of high stakes and shadowy figures that had nothing to do with the small, quiet town of Ridgewood. "I don't understand," Darius said, his voice strained. "What does this have to do with me? I just helped you change a tire." Lena's face tightened. "That's exactly it. By helping me, you've become a part of something bigger than you realize." She paused, her hands clenched into fists on the table. "My father's enemies. They've been looking for me. They want to use me to get to him. They'll do anything to control me. And now they know about you." Darius felt the weight of her words sink in. The kindness he'd shown a stranger had somehow dragged him into a dangerous game he didn't understand. He couldn't fathom how something so small, so simple, could have set this in motion. "You were trying to escape them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded, her eyes distant. "I've been running for months, trying to get away, trying to find a place where I could just be normal. But it's hard when your family's name is tied to so much power and corruption. There's no escape. They have eyes everywhere." She fell silent, as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. Darius sat across from her, his mind reeling. Everything was happening so fast. The SUV, the men in suits, the cryptic messages. It was all connected to Lena, to her family, to a world that Darius couldn't even begin to comprehend. "I didn't want to involve you, Darius," Lena said, breaking the silence. "But now, I'm afraid you're already in it. They're watching you, and if they think you're a threat, they'll do whatever it takes to neutralize that threat. I'm sorry. I never wanted this for you." Darius felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't know what to believe. Part of him wanted to walk away, to tell her it was all too much, and to go back to the life he knew. But the other part of him, the part that had helped her without hesitation, the part that believed in doing the right thing, wasn't so easily shaken. "You're telling me," he said slowly, trying to wrap his mind around the situation, "that your family's enemies are after you, and now after me?" Lena's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of sorrow and guilt. "Yes, and I can't just leave you to deal with this on your own. I need your help, Darius." For a long moment, Darius sat in silence, the gravity of her words pressing down on him. His thoughts were a whirlwind, racing through every possible outcome, every danger that could come from getting involved with Lena's world. But then, in the quiet of his kitchen, he realized something. Lena wasn't asking him to be a part of her family's business. She wasn't asking him to get involved in anything illegal or dangerous. Not directly, at least. She was asking for his help, for his protection. She was vulnerable, lost, and terrified. And he couldn't just turn his back on her now. Not after everything she had shared. "I don't know what's going on here, Lena," Darius said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that swirled inside him. "But you're right about one thing. You're not going through this alone." Lena's eyes widened, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over her. "You'll help me?" Darius nodded. "We'll figure this out. Together." As Lena sat back in her chair, her shoulders relaxed for the first time since entering the house, Darius couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision he had just made. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict, and he was about to step into a world far more dangerous than he had ever known. But whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't back out now. He was already in it, whether he wanted to be or not. Darius had hoped that Lena's arrival, with her cryptic warnings and desperate pleas, would mark the end of his involvement in the dangerous world of her family. He had tried to brush it off, telling himself that maybe everything would just settle down, that maybe she'd be able to go back to her life without dragging him deeper into her problems. But as he sat at his kitchen table, his mind racing with questions, he knew better. The visit from the two men, the ones representing Lena's family, had left him shaken. What did they want from him? Why had they shown up at his workplace? What kind of family had so much power that people would be willing to go to such lengths to thank someone for a simple act of kindness? Darius tried to focus on the routine of his daily life, but there was no escaping the feeling of eyes on him. Neighbors started to mention things. The black SUV that had been parked near his house, the strange men in suits walking up and down the street. It didn't take long before the gossip started. Ridgewood, for all its charm and quiet living, was a small town where news traveled fast. "You been getting visitors, Darius?" Greg, one of his co-workers, asked as they worked side by side on a repair at the community center. Darius didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on a rag, trying to keep his voice casual. "Some people came by the other day. They said they were looking for me, that's all." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Looking for you? Who exactly?" Darius shrugged. "I don't know. Just some guys in suits. Probably some kind of business thing. Nothing to worry about." Greg didn't seem convinced. "You sure? I heard talk that someone was asking about you from outside of town. You didn't get mixed up in anything, did you?" "I'm sure," Darius said firmly. But inside, a storm of doubt was starting to swirl. What if it wasn't just a coincidence? What if his kindness had brought him into something much darker? That evening, as Darius sat on his porch, the black SUV reappeared. This time, it wasn't just parked nearby, it was sitting across the street from his house, its engine running faintly in the background. its tinted windows offering no clues about the occupants. Darius's heart thudded in his chest. He had hoped it was all a misunderstanding, but he couldn't deny the truth any longer. He was involved in something much bigger than himself. The men were back. By the time Darius stepped outside to get a closer look, the SUV's engine revved to life, and it slowly rolled toward his driveway. The familiar men in suits climbed out, their polished shoes clicking sharply against the concrete. Richard, the older one, looked even more composed than before, while Grant, the younger man, stood silently by his side. Both men wore expressions that were professional to the point of being unsettling. Their calmness only heightened the sense of unease in Darius's gut. "Mr. Walker," Richard said, as if they'd known each other for years. "It's good to see you again." Darius stood still, his arms crossed over his chest. "I told you last time I'm not interested." Grant stepped forward this time, his blue eyes cold and calculating. "We understand your hesitance, Mr. Walker, but we're here to make you an offer, an opportunity you can't afford to ignore." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes as he continued. "You've done something remarkable, something rare in today's world. You helped Lena without asking for anything in return. That's why our employer, the Montgomery family, wants to show their gratitude." Darius felt a knot form in his stomach. He had a bad feeling about this. The way they spoke, so polished, so practiced, made it clear they weren't offering a simple thank you. They were selling something, and he wasn't sure he wanted to buy. "We're prepared to offer you a reward, Mr. Walker," Richard said smoothly. "A reward that will change your life." Darius's eyes narrowed. "A reward? I didn't help her for any reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Grant tilted his head slightly, as if studying Darius. "Of course, Mr. Walker, we understand, but sometimes doing the right thing comes with its own set of rewards, and we want to ensure that you're compensated for your kindness." "Compensated?" Darius repeated, the word sitting uncomfortably on his tongue. "And what exactly does that mean?" The older man took a step closer, lowering his voice just slightly, as if sharing a secret. "The Montgomery family doesn't just deal in simple transactions. They deal in opportunities. With their influence, you could have anything you want. Money, a new house, a better job, whatever you desire. Your life could be more comfortable than you ever imagined. We can help you build the future you've always dreamed of." There it was, the bait. Darius had heard about people like the Montgomerys before, powerful, wealthy, able to move mountains with a phone call. The idea of a better life, a life without worry, without struggle, tempted him for a fleeting moment. But then the weight of their words sank in, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. There was always a catch. There had to be. "I'm not interested," Darius said firmly, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in his mind. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like rejecting them outright was the only way to keep control of his life. If he accepted anything from them, where would it lead? How much would he have to give up in return? Richard's smile remained, but Darius could see a flicker of frustration behind his eyes. "Of course, Mr. Walker. We respect your decision. But think carefully. These kinds of opportunities don't come along every day." The men stood there for a moment, their silent pressure almost palpable, before Richard reached into his coat pocket and produced another card. This one was identical to the last, but this time, the message was more direct. "If you change your mind," Richard said, offering the card to Darius, "you know where to reach us." Darius took the card, but his hand felt heavy. as though the card itself was a symbol of something he couldn't control. He stared at it for a long moment, then slipped it into his pocket, his gaze never leaving the two men. "Good evening, Mr. Walker," Richard said with a final nod before turning on his heel and walking back to the SUV. Grant followed suit, and the engine roared to life once again. The vehicle drove off, its headlights disappearing into the night, leaving Darius standing alone on his porch. He watched the SUV vanish, but the unease didn't leave. The promise of riches, of a better life, everything they'd said made it sound so tempting, so easy. But something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the Montgomery family's offer than they were letting on. As the silence of the night settled around him, Darius knew one thing for certain. Rejecting their offer had been the right choice. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion that whatever was happening, whatever world Lena's family had drawn him into, wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And sooner or later he'd have to face whatever came next. The days that followed the offer from the Montgomery family were filled with unease. Darius couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Paranoia gnawing at him whenever he walked outside, whenever he stepped into his truck, whenever the silence of Ridgewood seemed just a little too still. The black SUV had appeared again, parked across the street just like before. And each time it came, the tension grew. The mysterious men had promised him a life-changing opportunity, but the more he thought about it, the less he believed it was an offer he could accept. No, this was something far more dangerous. Darius had done the right thing, helping Lena when she was stranded, offering nothing in return. But in doing so, he had unknowingly stepped into a world of power, influence, and deadly rivalries. The Montgomery family's enemies weren't just people to be feared, they were people who would do anything to get what they wanted. And now, Darius was involved. He had to find out who was behind the black SUV, why they were following him, and what it all had to do with Lena's troubled past. It was time to confront the shadow that had been hanging over his life, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Late that night, after another day spent trying to go about his usual routine, Darius couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, glancing toward the corner where the SUV had been parked for hours. It was still there, dark and silent, waiting for something or someone. His heart thudded in his chest, the weight of the decision hanging over him. He'd tried to ignore it, but now he had to know. The streets were quiet, the only sounds coming from the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hum of cars passing on the highway. As Darius approached the SUV, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. This wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about the unknown, about the powerful forces at play that he had never seen but could feel closing in. He moved slowly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The SUV's tinted windows made it impossible to see inside, but Darius knew someone was there. He had to confront them. He had to take control of this situation before it escalated any further. Taking a deep breath, he approached the vehicle and knocked on the window. For a moment, nothing happened. The vehicle remained perfectly still. Darius knocked again, harder this time, his breath misting in the cold night air. The tension was palpable. And then, the window slowly rolled down. A pair of cold, calculating eyes met his. It was the younger man, Grant. He looked calm, almost detached, as if this was all just another business transaction. "Mr. Walker," Grant said, his voice smooth, but there was an edge to it now. "We were hoping we wouldn't have to do this." Darius didn't flinch. "What are you doing here? Why are you following me? What do you want?" Grant's eyes narrowed slightly. his gaze flicking to the side as if considering whether to tell Darius the truth. After a tense pause, he finally spoke. "You're more involved in this than you realize," he said. "Lena's family has enemies, powerful ones. You helping her wasn't just a random act of kindness. It disrupted something much larger. And now people are looking for you." "Looking for me?" Darius repeated, the weight of the words sinking in. He felt like the ground was slipping away beneath him. Why? What does this have to do with me? Grant leaned forward, his voice dropping low. "Lena's father is a very influential man, but not everyone appreciates his methods. His rivals, people who would stop at nothing to take him down, are aware of your involvement, and they'll do anything to use you against him. They've already made moves. Now, you're a pawn in a game you didn't ask to play." Darius's mind raced. He had known there was more to Lena's story than she had let on, but this was something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "You're telling me that just helping her with a flat tire got me caught up in some kind of criminal power struggle?" Darius asked incredulously. Grant's gaze didn't waver. "Exactly. You've become a part of something bigger than you realize. You've been dragged into a world of secrets, lies, and power, and it's not something you can walk away from now." Before Darius could respond, the sound of a car door opening cut through the conversation. Richard, the older man, emerged from the shadows, his face unreadable. He glanced briefly at Grant, then turned his attention to Darius. "I'm afraid it's too late to turn back now," Richard said, his tone polite but firm. "The moment you helped Lena, you became involved in something you can't simply walk away from. But the choice remains yours. If you want out, we can offer you a way out, at a price." Darius felt his chest tighten, a cold realization dawning. "What price? What do you want from me?" Grant stepped forward now, his voice sharp. "We want you to help us. Help Lena's family secure their position. Join us, and we can make sure you're protected. Say no, and the consequences will be far more serious." The pressure was mounting. Darius could feel the weight of their words, the weight of his decision, but something in him refused to back down. This wasn't just about Lena anymore. It was about his life, his safety, and the price of getting too close to power. "I'm not interested in your offer," Darius said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "I didn't help her for any reward, and I'm not going to be part of your game." Richard's expression remained unchanged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of irritation. "Very well. But don't think this is the end. There are always consequences when people refuse an offer like this." Before Darius could react, the men turned and walked back to the SUV. The engine roared to life, and in a flash they sped off into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Darius stood there, his mind spinning. The tension that had built in his chest was now a gnawing uncertainty. He had rejected their offer, but in doing so he had only made things worse. As Darius turned to walk back to his porch, he heard the sound of tires screeching in the distance. He whipped around, only to see another car, a second black SUV, speeding down the road toward him. His blood ran cold. Without thinking, Darius sprinted for his front door, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of the SUV's engine grew louder as it closed the gap, its headlights blinding in the dark. Just as he reached the door, he heard the screech of tires as the vehicle came to a halt just inches from his driveway. Darius slammed the door behind him, locking it quickly. He stepped back, panting, his mind racing with the realization that things were no longer under his control. The chase was on. And now, the only thing he could do was survive. The night after the chase, Darius barely slept. His mind raced with questions about Lena, about the Montgomery family, about the men in suits who had seemed to know everything about him before he even knew about them. The black SUV had appeared yet again, but this time it wasn't parked outside his house. It had driven past, as if teasing him, as if it was just waiting for the right moment to confront him once more. By morning, Darius had made up his mind. He would confront the situation head-on. He couldn't keep running from it, not when the stakes were this high. His life, his future, everything had been turned upside down in a matter of days, and now, it seemed, he had no choice but to decide what kind of man he was going to be. But before he made any final decisions, Darius needed advice. He needed to hear from the people who knew him best, the ones who wouldn't sugarcoat things, who would tell him the truth, no matter how difficult it was to hear. His friends and family had always been his support system, the ones who kept him grounded, and today he would need that grounding more than ever. By midday, Darius was sitting at a worn-out diner booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His best friend Derek had agreed to meet him for a talk. Derek had been Darius's closest confidant since childhood, always the voice of reason when things got complicated. Today, though, Darius wasn't sure if any advice could make this decision any easier. Derek slid into the booth across from Darius, his expression serious as he looked at his friend. "So, you've been getting a lot of attention, huh?" Derek said, his tone light but with a hint of concern. Darius sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. "Yeah, you could say that. The Montgomery family, the men in suits, they're pushing hard for me to join them. But every time I think about it, I feel like I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my life." Derek raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "What's the deal with this family? You've been keeping me in the dark, Darius. What are they really offering you?" Darius shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had kept his friend at arm's length, partly out of pride, partly because he hadn't wanted to burden Derek with the weight of his decisions. But now, he realized he needed Derek's perspective more than ever. "They want to reward me for helping Lena. They've made me an offer, money, influence, whatever I want. But it's more than just that. They're asking me to join their world, to become part of their business, their network. And if I refuse, there's this feeling like they'll find a way to make things difficult." Derek leaned back in his seat, taking in the information. "Sounds like a hell of an offer," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "But what's the catch, Darius? There's always a catch." Darius swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing on his chest. "I don't know, man. I'm not naive. I can tell there's more to this than they're letting on. I've seen the way they operate, calm, calculating. They're not giving anything away for free. I've been warned that refusing them could put my family or even the whole town at risk." Derek's eyes hardened at the mention of family. "So, you're telling me that you've got these people threatening your family? That's not just a bad deal, Darius. That's a dangerous game you're playing." Darius nodded, frustration building inside him. "I didn't ask for this. All I did was help Lena change a damn tire, and now my life's turned upside down. If I say no, they're making it clear that the consequences won't just fall on me." "You've got to think about it," Derek said, leaning forward, his voice low. "Do you want to get involved in something like that? It might seem tempting. Hell, it sounds like it could change everything for you. But what kind of life do you want, Darius? What kind of person do you want to be?" Darius ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the question. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I want to do the right thing. I've always believed in helping people. But these people? They don't play by the same rules. The whole thing feels like a damn trap, but I can't escape it. It's like every move I make is part of their game." Derek studied him for a moment, then placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Look, man, you've got a good heart, but the question is, are you ready to lose yourself for a quick fix? You can have all the money and influence in the world, but is that really worth it if you lose your soul?" The diner's quiet hum felt like a distant echo as Darius absorbed Derek's words. "I've always tried to do the right thing, but now it feels like there's no right answer. If I walk away, I might be putting people I care about in danger, but if I accept, then I'm stepping into a world I can't control. What kind of man does that make me?" Derek exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "The man you've always been. The one who does the right thing, no matter what." Before Darius could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was an encrypted message, one that had been sent by one of the men in suits, Richard. His fingers hovered over the screen as he read the message. "We're offering you a final opportunity to join us, Mr. Walker. Refusing will have consequences, but we're willing to discuss terms. You have 24 hours to decide." The words hit Darius like a punch to the gut. He knew what it meant. This was it, their final offer. He couldn't run from it anymore. The Montgomerys weren't going to let him go that easily. Darius stared at the message for a long time, his mind racing with the weight of his decision. Derek watched him quietly, sensing the internal battle that was raging inside his friend. The pressure was overwhelming, the fear of what could happen if he refused gnawing at him, and yet, deep down, a part of him knew that accepting their offer would be a choice that would change everything. "What's it going to be, Darius?" Derek asked quietly. "What do you want?" The question hung in the air like a knife, cutting through the tension in the diner. Darius stood up, his mind spinning. There were no easy answers, no simple way out. He was standing on the edge of something far bigger than he ever imagined. "I don't know," Darius said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "But I have to make this choice, and I have to make it alone." As he left the diner, the world seemed to close in on him. The weight of his principles and the lure of a life beyond his wildest dreams pressed against him. He knew that whatever he decided, it would alter the course of his life forever. And now, standing on the precipice of everything he had ever known, Darius was about to make the most life-altering decision he had ever faced. The weight of Darius's decision felt like an anchor around his chest as he stood on the edge of the life he had known. He had spent the past few days thinking through every possibility. What would happen if he accepted the Montgomery family's offer? What if he rejected it? Could he live with himself if he became a part of their world? And, just as important, could he live with himself if he didn't? He had always prided himself on living a life of integrity. He helped others without expecting anything in return. But now, with the Montgomerys pushing him into a corner, he faced a choice he could no longer ignore. Late one night, after long conversations with Derek and others who cared about him, Darius stood in front of his porch, staring out into the quiet streets of Ridgewood. The black SUV had disappeared for now, but the sense of pressure remained, like a storm waiting to break. He'd made up his mind. He was going to do what felt right, even if it wasn't easy. The decision wasn't as simple as just accepting or rejecting the Montgomerys' offer. Darius had no illusions about what was at stake. The promise of wealth, power, and influence was tempting, but it wasn't what he wanted. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was to see his community grow, to make it a place where people helped each other, not because of what they stood to gain, but because it was the right thing to do. He had one condition. If he accepted, it had to be on his own terms. The Montgomery family was quick to respond. Their representatives arrived at his door the following day, this time with a more formal air of finality. Richard and Grant stood in front of him, no longer offering cryptic words or veiled threats. They came to offer him everything they had promised: money, influence, and whatever resources he could possibly need to build a future. "Mr. Walker," Richard began, a note of satisfaction in his voice, "you've made the right choice. You'll find that everything you desire is within reach. The Montgomerys know how to make things happen, and we can take you further than you've ever dreamed." Darius's heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He had accepted their offer, but only because he had managed to carve out a space for his principles within their world. He didn't want to live in their shadow, but he knew how to use their resources for good. His terms were simple. The money and influence had to go toward helping his town, toward building something meaningful for Ridgewood. The men in suits nodded, a small flicker of respect in their eyes. They had underestimated Darius, but now they saw that he wasn't someone to be controlled. He had turned their offer into an opportunity to make a difference. In the months that followed, Darius put his plan into motion. He used the resources provided by the Montgomery family to build the Ridgewood Community Center, a hub for education, job training, and support for families in need. But he didn't stop there. He set up scholarships for local students, ensuring they had access to higher education, and built programs that gave young people a chance to escape the cycle of poverty. As the center grew, so did the sense of unity in Ridgewood. What had once been a quiet, tight-knit town had become a place of hope, a beacon for those who needed help. People began to trust in each other more. They volunteered at the center, helped with the programs, and offered support to their neighbors. Darius's efforts, bolstered by the resources he had been given, had made an undeniable impact. But he never let the Montgomerys take credit. The center and its success were his community's success. It was a reminder that even in a world of power and influence, kindness and integrity could still prevail. But there was another choice Darius had considered: rejecting their offer entirely. The thought of turning down the wealth and security that came with their promise was daunting, but Darius knew that he had a choice. He didn't have to be part of their world. He didn't have to compromise his values. If he had turned them down, he knew he would have had to rally his neighbors, his friends, and the people of Ridgewood to make a stand. He would have appealed to the spirit of his town, the same spirit that had kept people looking out for each other for generations. He would have worked harder than ever to strengthen the bonds between the people of Ridgewood, turning them into something even greater than before, something that couldn't be broken by the Montgomerys' promises. Darius thought about Lena, too. When she had come to him for help, she had been running from something so dark and dangerous that she had never fully explained. And now, as he looked at the progress he'd made, he understood that her story had been more than just a simple problem to solve. It had been a catalyst for change, a turning point in his life that had led him to this exact moment. Lena's troubles had become his own, and though they were far from over, Darius knew that helping her was not just an act of kindness. It was a choice that had rippled outward, changing lives in ways he could never have predicted. The Montgomery family's influence still loomed in the background, but Darius had learned to use it wisely. They were no longer the ones in control. He had taken their offer, but he had reshaped it into something that could help his community, and he had done so on his own terms. His integrity had remained intact, and that was the most important thing. As he stood in front of the Ridgewood Community Center one evening, watching a group of children playing basketball on the newly built courts, he couldn't help but smile. He had taken a risk, a big one, but it had paid off. The town was thriving. people were thriving, and Darius felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Lena had kept in touch over the months, her presence a quiet reminder of the journey they had both gone through. She had started to build a life of her own, one that wasn't tied to her family's dark influence. She had become a volunteer at the center, working with the kids and sharing her story of escape with anyone who needed to hear it. "Looks like you made the right choice," Derek said, joining Darius outside. "You didn't just save the town, you saved yourself." Darius smiled, but there was something deeper in his eyes now. "I didn't save anything. We did this together, all of us." As the sun set over the small town of Ridgewood, Darius reflected on how far he had come. The decision to help Lena had set off a chain of events that had altered his life forever, but it had also shown him something powerful. A single act of kindness, no matter how small, could ripple out and change the world in ways you could never predict. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the horizon, Darius couldn't help but wonder, how many more lives could be changed by a simple act of kindness, and how far could that ripple reach? If you enjoyed Darius's story, you'll want to check out more tales of ordinary people making extraordinary choices. What would you do in his shoes? Could you stand by your principles when faced with the temptation of power and wealth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications so you won't miss out on the next life-changing journey. Thank you for watching. And remember, every small act of kindness can make a big difference.